Hi, on ninth day of 30 days reading challenge. Book uh, Plato, The Republic by Plato. Book 10, page number 282. Okay, you are right, for if the soul's own evil and badness isn't enough to kill and destroy it, and evil appointed for the destruction of something else will hardly kill it. Indeed, it won't kill anything at all except the very thing it is appointed to destroy. Hardly is right, or so it seems. Now, if the soul isn't destroyed by a single evil, whether its own or something else's, then clearly it must always be. And if it always is, it is immortal. Necessary, so be it. And if it is so, then you realize that there would always be the same souls, for they could not be made fewer if none is destroyed, and they could not be made more numerous either. If something immortal is increased, you know that the increase would have to come from the mortal, and then everything would end up being immortal. That's true. Then we must not think such a thing, for the argument does not allow it. Nor must we think that the soul is in its truest nature is full of multi-colored variety and unlikeness, or that is different by with itself. What do you mean? It isn't easy for anything composed of many parts. It isn't easy for anything composed of many parts to be immortal if it isn't mushed together in the finest way. Yet, this is how the soul now appeared to us. It, it probably isn't easy. Yet, our recent argument and others as well compel us to believe that the soul is immortal. But to see the soul as it is in truth, we must not study it as it is while it is maimed by its association with the body and other areas, which is what we are doing earlier, but as it is in a pure state. That's how we should study the soul thoroughly by and by means of logical reasonings. We will then find we will then find that it is much finer thing than we thought, and we can see justice and injustice as well as the other things we have discussed far more clearly. What we have said about soul is true of it as it appears at present, but the condition in which we have studied it is like that of the sea god Glaucus, whose primary nature isn't easily to be made out by those who catch glimpse of him. Some of the original parts have been broken off, others have been crushed, and his whole body has been maimed by the waves and by the shells she would, and stones that have attached themselves to him, so that he looks more like a wild animal than his natural self. The soul, too, is in a similar condition. Then we study it, beset by many evils. That's glaucon. That glaucon is why we have to look somewhere else in order to discover its true nature. Too fair to its philosophy or love of wisdom. We must realize what it craves and longs to have intercourse with, because it is akin to the divine and immortal, and what always is, and we must realize what it would become if it followed this longing with its whole being, and if the resulting effort lifted it to the sea in which it now dwells. And if the many stones and shells, those which have grown all over it in a wild, earthly, and stony profusion, because it feasts and so called happy feasting on earth, were hammered off it, then we would see what its true nature is, and be able to determine whether it has many parts or just one, and whether or is what manner to it is to put together. But we have already given a decent account, I think, of what its condition is and what part it has when it's immersed in human life. We certainly have. And haven't we cleared away the various other objections of our argument without having to invoke the rewards and reputations of justice? As you said, Homer and Herodotus, and haven't we found that justice itself is the best thing for the soul itself, and that the soul, whether it has the ring of Gyges or even it together with the cope of it, should do things we have. That's absolutely true. Then can there now be any objections? Look, if in addition we return to justice and the rest of virtue, both the kind and quantity of wages that they obtain from the soul, from human beings and God, whether in this life or the next, none whatever, then will you give me back what you borrowed from me during the discussion? What are you referring to in particular? I granted you your request that a just person should seem unjust and an unjust one just. For you said that even if it would be impossible for these things to remain hidden from both goods and human, from both gods and human, still this had to be granted for the sake of argument, so that justice itself could be judged in relation to injustice itself. Don't you remember that? It would be wrong of me not to. Well, then, since they have now been judged, I ask that the reputation justice is in fact has among gods and humans be returned to its, and we agree that it does indeed have such a reputation and is entitled to carry off the prizes it gains for something by making him seem just. It is already clear that it gives good things to anyone who is just, and that it does not deceive those who really possess it. That's a fair request. They want you first grant that it does not escape the notice of the gods, at least as to which of the two is just and which isn't. We will. Then, if neither of them escapes the god notice, one would be loved by the gods and the other hated, as we agreed at the beginning. That's right. And won't we also agree that everything that comes to someone who is loved by God, insofar as it comes from the God themselves, is the best possible, unless it is inevitable punishment for some mistakes he made in a former life, certainly. Then we must suppose that the same is true of a just person who falls into poverty or disease or someone other apparent evil, namely that this will end well for him either during his lifetime or afterwards. For the gods never neglect anyone who eagerly wishes to become just and who make himself as much like a god as a human can by adopting a virtuous way of life. It makes sense that such a person not be negative by anyone who is like him, and must not be opposed that the opposite is true of an unjust person. Definitely. Then these are some of the prizes that a just person, but not an unjust one, receives from the gods. That's certainly my opinion. What about from human beings? What does a just person get from them? Or if we are to tell the truth, isn't this what happens? Aren't clever but unjust people like runners who run well for the first part of the course but not for the second? They leap away sharply at first, but they become ridiculous by the end and go off uncrowned, with their ears dropping on their shoulders like those of exhausted dogs, while true learners, on the other hand, get to the end, collect the prizes, and are crowned. And isn't it also generally true of just people to, that towards the end of each course of action, associations, or life, they enjoy a good reputation and collect their prizes from other human beings, of course. Then will you allow me to say that the things about them that you yourself said about unjust people? I'll say that it is just people who, when they are old enough, rule in their own cities, if they happens to want ruling office, and that it is they who marry whomever they want to give their children in marriage to whomever they want. Indeed, all the things that you said about unjust people, I now say about justice. As for unjust people, the majority of them, even if they escape detection when they are young, are caught by the end of the race and are ridiculed. And by the time they get old, they have become wretched, for they are insulted by foreigners and citizens, beaten with whips, and made to suffer those punishments, such as reckoning and burning, which you rightly describe as cruel. Imagine that I have said that they suffer all such things, and see whether you will allow me to say it. Of course, I will. What you say is right. Then these are the prizes, wages, and gifts that a just person receives from gods and humans while he alive, and that are added to the good things that justice itself provides. Yes, and they are fine and secure ones too. Yet they are nothing in either number or size compared to those that await just and unjust people after death. And these things must also be heard if both are to receive in full what they are owed by the argument. Then tell us about them, for there are not many things that would be more pleasant to hear. It isn't, however, a tale of Alcinous that I will tell you, but that of a brave Pamphylian man called the son of Armenius, who once died in a war. When the rest of the dead were picked up 10 days later, they were already putrefying, but when he was picked up, his corpse was still quite fresh. He was taken home and preparations were made for his funeral. But on the 12th day, when he was already laid on the funeral pile, he revived, and having done so, told that he had seen in the world beyond. He said that after his soul had left him, it travelled altogether with many others until they come to a marvelous place where there were two adjacent openings in the earth, and opposite and above them two others in the heaven, and between them judges sat. These having rendered their judgment, ordered the just to go upward into the heaven through the door on the right, with a sign of the judgment attached to their chest, and the unjust to travel downward through the opening on the left, with the sign of their deeds in their backs. When Ar himself came forward, they told him that he was to be a messenger of human beings about the things that were there, and that he was listened to and look at everything in the place. He said that he saw souls departing after judgment through one of the openings in the heavens and one in the earth, while through the others two souls were arriving from the door in the earth. Souls came up covered with dust and dirt from the door in the heavens. In the heavens was come down pure, and the souls who were arriving all the time seems to be on long journey, so that they went gladly to the meadow, like a crowd going to a festival and camped there. Those who knew each other exchanged greeting, and those who came up from the earth asked those who came down from the heavens about the things there, and were in turn questioned by them about the things below. And so they told their stories to one another, the former weeping they called as they recalled all they had suffered and seen on their journey below the earth, which lasted 1,000 years, while the latter, who had come from heaven, told about how well they had fared, and about the inconceivable find and the beautiful sight they had seen. There was much to tell Lukon, and it took a long time. But the main point was this: for each in turn of the unjust things they had done, for each in turn for the people they had wronged, they paid the penalty 10 times over, once in every century of their journey. Since a century is roughly the length of a human world, this means they paid a tenfold penalty of each justice. If, for example, some of them had caused many deaths by betraying cities or armies and reducing them to slavery, or by participating in other wrongdoing, they had to suffer 10 times the pain they had caused to each individual. But if they had done good deeds and become just and pious, they were rewarded according to the same scale. He said some other things about stillborn and those who lived only for a short time, but they are not worth recounting. And he also spoke of even greater reward or penalty of for pity or impity towards gods and parents, and for murder with one's own hand. For example, he said he was there when someone asked another where the great Ardias was. This Ardias was said to have been tyrant in some cities in Pamphylia 1,000 years before, and to have killed his aged father and old brother, and committed many other impious deeds as well. And he said that the one who was asked responded, "He hasn't arrived here yet, and never will." For this too was one of the terrible sights we saw when he came near the opening on our way out. After all our sufferings were over. We suddenly saw him together with some others, pretty well all of whom were tyrants, although there were also some private individuals among them who had committed great crimes. They caught that they were ready to go up, but opening wouldn't let them through. For it rode whenever one of these incurably wicked people or anyone else who hadn't paid a sufficient penalty tried to go up, and there were savage men, all fearly to look at, who were standing by, and when they heard the roar, they grabbed some of these criminals and led them away. But they bound the feet, hands, and head of the RDS and the others threw them down and fled them. Then they dragged them out of the way, lacerating them on thorn bushes and telling every passenger that they were to be thrown into tatters, and explaining why they were being treated in this way. And he said that of their many fears, the greatest each one of them had was that the roar would be heard as he came up, and that everyone has immensely relieved when silence greeted him. Such then were the penalties and punishment and the rewards corresponding to them.